Roger Eddy, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel. Before we get started in the interview, let me just say for the viewers that you're also a member of the Illinois Channel Board. But we wanted to talk to you as we tape this on June the 9th. We still don't have a state budget. The schools are going to be opening in somewhere along the line of, 6 to 7 weeks or something like that. What's happening inside school boards and school districts across the state of Illinois at this moment where you don't know if you're going to be even having the money to open schools?
Well, I think school districts across Illinois are analyzing where they are. June 30th, of course, is the end of the fiscal year for most school districts in the state, and they're going to determine how they ended the year, what their expenses are for next year, what their cash flow is, and for some, because they rely on money from the state, they're going to try to calculate without state money, when it is that they might have to consider not opening their doors. So we sent out, the Management Alliance, through the Superintendents Association, and the business officials sent out a toolkit just a few days ago to school officials so that they can begin to have those conversations, analyze their current position, and communicate to their public, which I think is tremendously important, the position they're in, and eventually, in a transparent manner, show them exactly how much they have and how long it might be until they reach a crisis.
So we're obviously going to have differences in funding levels around the state. So some schools will have a lot of money in the bank, others may have virtually none. Do you imagine that, what would you foresee a school district doing? Would they say, if we can't stay open for 6 months, we're not going to open at all? Or do you think that they would basically open their doors and operate as long as they can?
Well, 6 months is a long time. I think when you have revenue or you have resources available, no matter where it comes from, based on the cash flow, some of it's going to be property taxes that come due and be dispersed at a certain time, that you're going to stay open because you have the revenue to stay open. Will there come a point when some of these districts do not have revenue to stay open? Absolutely. Some may have already used tax revenue they're anticipating this fall for tax anticipation warrants to make it through the spring. So that's not really cash, that's money that's going to pay off existing debt. They're going to be in a different situation than a school district that was able to make it through this year and has property tax revenue coming in, and they might be able to last several months based on property tax revenue. And when the part of the year comes when they've always relied on state aid to take over, and they've exhausted their local resources, they're going to have to close. So the key is analyzing that and then communicating that to the public so that your taxpayers and your local parents understand exactly the situation that you're in and what might be forthcoming should there not be a budget. And, to do it in an open, honest, and transparent way, your number one mission, your number one responsibility is to serve the educational interests and resources that you have to meet those for children in your district. And you need to do that as long as you can.
What are there with the teachers who are the labor side of education, let's say, are there legal requirements that if you have to close a school because you're just not going to have the money, is there some lead time by which you have to say to the teachers, hey, we're going to have to close come 3 months from now or 2 months from now?
Well, I think you certainly have to make known to everyone in the community, and the teachers are an important part of both the school community and the larger community. So, I think you're going to have to make sure everyone understands your position based on the revenue you have and other local considerations, whether or not in some cases, for example, school districts are willing to borrow money to go a little bit longer. That will all be determined locally. Some may have reached their debt capacity. There are legal limits to how much they can borrow, and they may have reached that. They need to let teachers know, they need to let parents know, they need to let community members know, and just as importantly, they need to have that conversation with their elected officials and let them know exactly where they stand and the effect that it's going to have. And not only if they can't open, but there's also the effect that diminished funding has on what you're able to provide, even if you can stay open. Is it a quality program? What have you had to cut? What have you had to do in order to keep those doors open that have, diminished the education quality that you're offering children?
The Illinois Channel just aired a press conference that the superintendents held. Now, some people may go, well, wait a minute, how are the schools bad? Because that's the one part of the state budget that the governor and the legislature have funded, the per pupil spending. But there's an area called categoricals that isn't being funded, and the superintendents were saying the state collectively owes us $1.1 billion. But if you break it down to an individual school district, and you came from, as a state representative, a rural area, the cost of busing alone can be very expensive, right? And so what impact, where are the schools? I guess the question would be this. As you talk to other school boards and school districts around the state, what is there any consensus that they say, if you're not going to give us a full budget, you know, that they're obviously, how much of a pressure, I'm trying to form the question, but how much pressure is there to form a full budget as compared to saying, okay, we'll at least take the same thing we got last year where you're funding per pupil?
Well, first of all, the superintendents that came did a terrific job. I think they made the case to their local representatives and the General Assembly as a whole. I watched the press conference, and they were spot on. Mandated categoricals for FY17 haven't been paid, over $1 billion. So they said, you know, we need payment for those categoricals. That was money that we budgeted in some cases to keep our doors open. So that point was well made. The point about needing a budget for K-12 was well made, but the broader point is a budget that funds social services also helps school districts. So school districts rely on an array of social services that are available to communities that may not be being funded, even though the school is being funded. So I think the broader message is we need a full budget so that all of those services that communities use and work together to support children can be funded in a way that really helps the education of kids outside of the school budget. So, but I think their message was good, and I think they had their priorities straight and really delivered in a strong way. So we're really happy and proud of the work they did that day.
For the viewers' sake, so you represented a rural area in the legislature, so you know, and you worked as a superintendent yourself, right? So you are very familiar with education. It's your career. But as a state legislator, you also saw, you know, and this job, you know what's going on around the state, upstate, downstate, etc. Andy Menard, and was a backer for making the case for school funding reform. What are your thoughts on that? Not just to make it about Andy Menard, but just in general. To what extent do we need school funding reform, and is there any direction that you think the state ought to be going?
Well, you know, I think Senator Menard, to his credit, made this, shine a spotlight on what I think people have known for a long time, and that is Illinois has a terribly inequitable funding system, and one that needs to be corrected. There have been several attempts to do that. Senator Barrickman kind of became very involved in the same way to try and shine a spotlight on it, but not only talk about what's wrong, but here's how we can fix it. And of course, the Alliance management, including school board associations, superintendents, principals, and business officials, along with some other partners, through our Vision 2020 resource program for what we thought the future of education should be like, champion an evidence-based funding model. And we believe very strongly that that is a much better model to provide real transparency as to what the adequacy target for each school district in the state should be based on their student population, their unique demographics. And we also believe that the distribution model that was in that formula, as it was supported by the Alliance, really distributed new dollars in a manner that would drive those dollars to the districts that were the farthest away from the adequacy target. Things happen along the way to what you believe to be the right way to do things, and politics sometimes gets involved in that. But the formula itself and the 27 elements and the tier distribution, I think, is as solid as ever and has a tremendous amount of support, and we certainly support it.
I might ask a question, when does it become critical as far as opening the schools? And as I asked that, it's probably critical right now. But is there a point in time where you say, look, if we don't have the funds, if you guys don't pass even some partial funding for education, we're just not going to be able to open? Where's that line of demarcations that the viewers should be looking to say, here's the drop dead date. That otherwise, you really just either don't open the schools or you're going to have to push the opening day back to Labor Day.
Well, I think those calculations have to take place now. I think the fact is that today we don't have a budget that will fund K-12 education. So if you're doing the responsible thing at the local level, you're making those calculations. And it's going to be different. Every school district is going to have that different date that you're talking about. But those calculations should be done now. And you have a reasonable idea of how much revenue you are going to be taking in based on property taxes. You know when state aid payments normally would take place and when you need them to fit into cash flow to open your doors for a certain period of time. So I think those calculations and those communications, as I said earlier, need to be done now. Time is of the essence to make sure that you communicate with both your public, your teachers, as you mentioned, and also members of the General Assembly. So hopefully those calculations will be done quickly in June by school boards led by their superintendents and business officials, and parents will be informed and they'll know if it's August 15th, if it's September 15th, whatever those days are that they're facing that pressure that you described, they'll be able to communicate that to their local constituencies.
Let me ask one last question. We'll close out. There was some rumor that the governor would call a special session. That's almost wouldn't surprise anybody, I don't think. I'm curious, are you in communication with the administration? I mean, given your position here as head of the school boards, or do you hear from Beth Purvis or anyone else? Are they reaching out to you and asking for relative to education funding for your input?
Well, we've had in the past communications with Dr. Purvis, and certainly we communicate with the administration along with the four leaders. And recently we did send a communication to them that really kind of told them what they already knew, and that's how critical it is for schools to have a budget to operate with and to plan. So as necessary, and as we get these stories and as school districts let us know, we certainly pass that information along so they understand the critical nature. But I think they have a pretty good idea. I heard Dr. Tony Smith, the other day in a stakeholders meeting talk about the fact that the State Board of Education, monitors this stuff as well, and the funding issues that are facing certain districts. They're, I'm sure, getting calls directly from those school districts. But yeah, we communicate as we need to. We also understand that, the administration and Dr. Purvis working on an array of issues, and this is one part of a huge kind of public policy questions that they're trying to determine. But we're going to advocate for schools and for a budget for schools. We would love to see a full budget. That really is what should happen, because a full budget does really, in a broader way, support what we're trying to do in education.
Roger Eddy, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.